Hello and welcome back to the From My Perspective podcast, where I, Jackson McCarty, tell you all the names you need to know in the college football and NFL landscapes that could be changing the football landscape in the very near future. Now, before we get into the second layer of the prediction for the top 25 post the regular season and conference championship season, I'm not doing a preseason top 25. I would like to predict how the season is going to go so you guys can make fun of me later. But in order to make fun of me later, in order to find the channel, find the next part of this, find the first episode, or find the last one, because we're just doing 11 through 20 today, you've got to subscribe. And I don't like asking to do that. It's not really my thing, but I would really appreciate it if you go ahead and do that. Now, looking back at the last one, there were a couple interesting ones that I picked. I had BYU and Tennessee closing out the top 10. I think those are probably pretty divisive. Georgia at like 6, pretty comfortably out of the playoff race, or not the playoff race, but out of the playoff picture at the end of the season, primarily because I do think they'll pick up a loss in the regular season and a loss in the conference championship. But now it's time to look at that next wave of teams, the teams that are kind of vying for a New Year's Six Bowl, some teams that may still be popping up in conference championships, stuff like that. And the top team I want to talk about today is NC State. They lead off our video for today, and NC State comes in at 11. And I'm not entirely in on the Devin Leary hype. Last time I talked about him, I called him Dennis Leary, who is an actor and not at all the quarterback for North Carolina State. NC State is not just about him. It is not just a quarterback and a whatever roster around him, kind of like what we saw North Carolina be last year with Sam Howell after everybody had left. That's not NC State's problem. They got tons of starters staying around. 3 on offense and 2 on defense are leaving. 5 total between those sides of the ball out of 22. I think that's pretty good turnover. And while I do think the ACC is in for a bit of a bounce back, it does knock NC State down a tad, but I still think that they're a really good program. One that will have a lot of chemistry coming into the 2022 season. I'm projecting them to finish with the same record they had last year, so I've got them at 10-2, and I've got a couple shot games in Texas Tech and Boston College being the ones that they lose along the way. I do think that they beat Clemson, especially early in the season. I think that's probably the turning point. If you'll recall from that last episode that I said that they'll switch from DJ to Kate Klubnik, I think that's probably the turning point, and I think that will end up being the biggest part of their season, probably the highest high that they get to. Overall, it's a very good offense. It's a very good defense, but I could see them hitting a couple snags along the way. So I have to predict them kind of where my gut tells me, and that tells me just outside of that top 10, but still a very competitive program, still with a lot of good pieces. So that adds, I believe, the second ACC team that we've got so far. I had a Big 12 school already. I've got one in the playoffs, and this is the team that I believe challenges them the most, Oklahoma State being that team in the playoffs. I see the Baylor Bears being quite a tough team to beat, just slightly below as far as talent and team, or the players that are leaving. I think it's a little bit harder for them to get to that upper echelon of football. The Big 12 is going to be a dogfight. The most stability is going to win, and I think Dave Aranda can provide a lot of stability for a locker room, even whenever there is a lot of turnover. Actually, in the regular season, I project Baylor beats Oklahoma State in the regular season, but then loses to them in the conference championship, which ends up turning their season to a 2-loss season and takes them from potentially being in the playoffs to just right outside of the top 10, and still a very, very solid season, very strong team, just not getting the hype. And maybe it could have been a Clemson, Baylor, OSU, Alabama playoff in this prediction. You flip one around, you give it the nod to the other, and that's kind of how it shakes out. So a loss at the end of the year to Texas, who finds their groove. You may or may not see them. I'm not going to give too many spoilers away here, but that's where I think their first loss comes to. And then they've got the Oklahoma State game. There's a couple issues there, and they end up finishing at 10-3 with that conference championship game, which puts them just outside the window. And you might have noticed from the first episode, and you'll continue to notice as we go through this, I'm a sucker for a team that doesn't need a star like Oklahoma State. I don't think you need some guy that's knocking down the doors and being a super duper problem, because that team cohesion is just really impressive to me. And I think it's a lot of times more sustainable, because if the teams that do rely on a star, let's point at Miami right now with Tyler Van Dyke. If he has a really bad stretch of 2-3 games, now all of a sudden your season has completely flipped on its head, and you're having to catch back up, and hopefully he gets hot. Whereas not Oklahoma State, but Baylor doesn't really need one of those guys to just be phenomenal. They'll just go in and play good, and even if somebody's kind of worse for wear, somebody else will take up that load. One of the teams that I actually think could be kind of prone to those issues with the Stars, more specifically quarterback and how that situation gets handled. Texas A&M, who I think a lot of people see as a potential playoff team this year, I have them coming in now at 13. That makes the fourth SEC team that has now appeared, and we're just in the top 13, which speaks volumes as to how talented the SEC is. The real hype for A&M is their draft, or not their draft class, but their recruitment class and the appeal that comes with that and the glitz and the glamour. But I don't think you're going to rely on a lot of freshmen, and you're definitely not going to be a top, 6, 7, 8 team with that schedule relying on a bunch of freshmen. So I'm kind of in a play it by ear situation with them. Let things unfold as they will, and probably next year will be their year that they hop up. I mean, I've got key losses to Miami, Alabama, and then I got a shocker of a loss against South Carolina, which really puts a damper on the season. Otherwise, a very talented team that goes through the year using these new pieces that they've got in there to kind of develop an identity and slowly progress towards being a really solid program. But I don't think this is their year, and I do think they kind of have to take a step back almost, because you're losing guys like Isaiah Spiller. You don't know who your quarterback's going to be. Kenyon Green's gone, very important piece for your offensive line. There's a number of guys that are going that they're going to have to replace, and so I'm going to kind of take a step back. So I mentioned that they're going to get a lot of guys coming in to replace and going to have to figure it out on the fly. That's even more so true with our next team, number 14 on this list, which is the University of Southern California. Yes, they, again, another potential playoff contender just because of how loaded up their transfer portal was. But I'm already a little bit alarmed when you look at like the Jordan Addison rumors that he's unhappy. I know he came out on social media. He has since deleted it, but he called it fake news. But the fact that narrative's there's at least a little bit of smoke that things aren't quite going to plan right off the bat, and they don't have to, but when you have that many cooks in the kitchen that were stars at other universities, how often does that really mesh together? And you see that in a lot of different sports, that it doesn't always work together unless they were brought in and developed a chemistry and made each other stars. That's really not the case for this school. It really does boil down to being a chemistry issue for me. I think more cohesive units like Utah and back-to-back losses at the end of the year to both UCLA and Notre Dame are really what's going to set them back. Of kind of a similar instance, you see a lot of teams kind of closer to the end of the year fumble up a little bit, and whereas at the beginning of the year you'll lose a game like Clemson, they ended up in the playoffs. I had them losing to NC State, but that gives them enough time to go on this monster tear and really figure things out to where the committee is looking at it and like, okay, they're a much better team than they were, 5, 6, 7 weeks ago. USC doesn't get that. They have to exit the season coming out on a couple big losses, and that in turn puts them into 14th. Overall, I think if you're going to sit down on your couch on a Saturday and turn on the USC football game, you're going to see one of the best offenses in the nation and a defense that is going to be pretty hard to watch a pretty decent amount of time. Does that sound kind of familiar to you? Maybe it was happening in Norman, Oklahoma under a certain coach's watch, because that coach really likes offense, but he hasn't figured out the defensive side of the ball yet. So that's going to be a major thing for them to watch out for, especially just as the season progresses. You've got to really sort out some of those issues, and I don't think that the foundation that they're building on and the heavy emphasis that they've put on offense has really aligned them to be in that position. So that is, I believe, they are our first Pac-12 team, if I'm recalling correctly. I might be wrong on that, but we completely leave the Big Five entirely. We get our first Power 5 school. It's the University of Houston. The Cougars have arrived. I do think they will be the best Group of 5 school in college football this year. Oh, to retract that previous statement, Utah was like my 5th ranked team. I completely forgot about Utah. So the USC is our second Pac-12 team. That would make Utah our first. But Houston as a whole, their activity in the transfer portal, very inspiring. They weren't afraid to go load up. And I would suggest that they've got the most to prove out of the AAC teams before the jump is made to the Big 12. I think UCF with Gus Malzahn and just the general lineage that they have with him and with recent success under Blake Bortles and Mackenzie Milton and Dylan Gabriel and all those guys, that kind of carries its own weight right now. And you have such an established head coach at an SEC school formerly. And then you've got Cincinnati, who is fresh off of a playoff spot. So Houston is pretty comfortably the team that has to set out and be like, look, we are legit, we are real, we are going to be a problem in the Big 12. And I think an 11-1 season this year does the trick. Clayton Tune, I think he'll be in contention for the best Group of 5 quarterback all year. I do think that Grayson McCall is a little bit better than him. I really like Grayson McCall. Some of my earliest videos you can find me talking about how much I like Grayson McCall. Clayton Tune, not a slouch though. He will be a problem for other teams. He'll be awesome for Houston. And I think that will be pretty helpful as to boost them up. Their schedule as an entirety is very winnable. The only game I have them dropping is against SMU, who I think is a sneaky good football team, especially whenever you think about the fact that they lost Sonny Dykes. But Rhett Lashley, I praised him as being a really good hire for that program. I got them finishing at 8-4, so it's not even a bad loss realistically, especially if it's a close game to a team that's well above 500. They won't be our last G5 school though. I'll tell you that much. I have a special place in my heart for Group of 5 schools that can find themselves ranked. They will not be the last one in this. I'm not going to say that it's another 4, 5, 6 teams, but there's plenty of involvement there. So that is our first true Group of 5. I know you have the 2 independent schools in Notre Dame and BYU that I already have ranked at 8th and 9th respectively, but this is the first true one and who I believe is the top G5 school in college football next year. So we return to the Power 5 next, and a conference we've already made a trip to. We go back to the Big Ten now, where we've seen Ohio State ranked, we've seen Michigan ranked. You would assume this is Michigan State, but you'd be wrong because it is the Wisconsin Badgers. Wisconsin, I have returning to just a monster run of form. If you look at it in its entirety, they haven't lost more than 4 games in a season outside of the COVID year since Paul Chryst has been the head coach. There's something to say about that, and that says that he knows how to win no matter what is on the field, and he finds a way. So I've got a lot of like for their team. Braylon Allen, obviously, is phenomenal. Graham Mertz, very good he will be better, and I still think he's got a lot of talent. Just as a whole, they've got a solid foundation. They've got a couple key pieces. They'll figure it out. And I've got them having a 10-2 finish, a pretty convincing loss to Ohio State in the conference championship, back down to 10-3, kind of a similar situation that we see from Baylor. But I do think that their 2 losses are a little bit more significant, and therefore it earns them a couple of spots lower than what you might expect from a 10-3 finish. I know they lost their defensive coordinator, and I believe he went to Ohio State now, and that's tough. But I think that they've got the in-house talent around that position or around that spot already. As you can see, it takes a village to make a great defense. It just so happens Wisconsin is pretty good at figuring out how to do that. So I've got them returning to form, being the 3rd best team in the Big Ten. Technically, I think that they contend with Michigan as far as best roster due to the fact that they know how to solidify, and Michigan lost so many people. But yeah, that puts them just on the back half of today's episode at number 16. Now, number 17 will mark another SEC team coming in, and at this point, we've had A&M, we've had Georgia, we've had Alabama. We go now to Arkansas. We've got Sam Pittman and the boys rising up and hitting the 17 spot in the rankings. Once again, they'll play above their weight. I don't think Arkansas is all that exceptionally talented of a program. I think they've got a couple great players. But I think a lot of it comes in, and again, with what I've been preaching, with the Wisconsins and the Houstons and the BYUs and the Baylors. The consistency, it's the name of the game. If you can't win as a team, football is a team sport. Just like wins aren't a quarterback stat. It really boils down to how well you play with the guys around you, and Arkansas has found their way of really being good at that. KJ Jefferson will continue to be good. I think he really came along at the end of the season last year and is probably the best Arkansas quarterback I didn't like the Allen brothers, or I didn't like how they played, so I'll give it from since Mallet, because I think Mallet was the last true gunslinger they had that could really just air it out. And KJ can do that, plus he's got a little bit of mobility. So I like what he's bringing to the program. They've got some guys that can fill spots. On defense, they always just find random walk ons that are like the key component of their defense. They'll continue to do that. And Sam Pittman will continue to earn praise for what he's doing with the program. A better record, or a better team rather than the record says, because I have them finishing at 9-3, but you got losses to Alabama. You've got to go to Utah to play BYU, which I have them losing, and losing to A&M after Arkansas beat them last year. It does knock them down a peg, and it's hard because you can't really congest the top 12, 13 with all SEC schools, because if you have 4 or 5 at that point, oh yeah, you have Tennessee up there too. They're at number 10, so this is really the 5th SEC school in the top 17, which is already pretty congested. So this feels like a pretty nice location for them to be. And my real thing is, I think that they're about a Treylon Burks away from having one of the best offenses in college football, because they'll always find running backs. And you could have had a grouping of Hudson Henry, Jaden Hasselwood, and Treylon Burks, which right there, that's, I mean, a very, very good foundation and very good targets for KJ Jefferson to find. I think even having Treylon back this year would probably find them a win in either that Texas A&M or BYU game. Not really sure which one, but I think that would have sorted them out. Unfortunately, it does put them down just a touch. We stay in the South for the next team, but we go to the ACC now. It's Miami, and I mentioned them earlier, kind of being star-driven with Tyler Van Dyke. I think that Mario Cristobal getting there might help realign a little bit of that, and I think he'll get Miami just as a whole in working order and get stuff figured out pretty quick. He has a really nice schedule to start off the season to get them in line. It's the end of the year that's really going to be the trick. You've got UVA, Florida State, Clemson, Pitt. They're all candidates to damage them. I'll take FSU, Clemson, and Pitt beating them, especially after they've kind of more or less coasted their way to the end of the season, and then you hit these big roadblocks. I think that they do beat FSU, but I think University of Virginia with Brennan Armstrong could be really good. Clemson, I have them as a national champion contender, and then Pitt, they're always pretty solid. So just as a collective there, I think they take a couple hits. And the thing that I'm kind of watching out for is I think Tyler Van Dyke could absolutely be a Heisman candidate, but I think at the end of the year, it's going to become kind of what happened to Brady Quinn in the bowl game against Jamarcus Russell, where Quinn struggled and it cost him what would end up being the first overall pick. This is a Heisman Trophy and maybe even top 5 contention for Tyler Van Dyke. But I think some of these big teams and not really being in that mindset of playing those big teams comes back to hurt him a little bit and makes him fall probably out of that top 4 whenever they solidify the Heisman finalist. So yeah, it's Miami is a good team. I think they will continue to get good. We know Cristobal can recruit the lights out of the building, and this is his first year being this highly ranked inside the top 20. I would call that a success. So we now move on. If you recall in the Wisconsin pick not too long ago, I had said that this is probably not the Big Ten school you were expecting because the team that I imagine you were expecting comes in now. We're talking about Michigan State, and everybody loves Mel Tucker's success right now, outside of CU Buffs fans, that is, but how do you replace Kenneth Walker? How do you replace that success? I know you got a couple of running backs, Jarek Broussard from Colorado and Jalen Berger from Wisconsin, but the committee approach, I still don't see replacing what Kenneth Walker brought to you last year. And outside of that, I'm not really sure I'm that in love with their team. And you've only got 5 offensive starters returning as a whole. So combining that with your Big Ten schedule, combining that with the fact that you're losing Kenneth Walker outside of these other players that are gone, it really makes things quite difficult for Michigan State to get over the hump. And I think that a top 20 finish right now would still be very good, especially considering the amount of Big Ten schools that are also in my top 20 that we've gotten to this point. I'm just, I don't feel 100% confident that they're going to be among the top of the top with like Michigan and Ohio State like they were last year. So they take a bit of a step back. And another team that takes a giant step back will be the last team we talk about today, because we are only doing 11 through 20. And this team was a playoff team last year. We've got all the other 3 playoff teams out of the way, so you can probably guess who it is. Cincinnati Bearcats make the second group of 5 team, at least for this year, in the top 20. And man, they have a ton of work to do to replace all these people. Like, listen to this list. Quarterback Desmond Ridder, running back Jerome Ford, wide receiver Alec Pierce, cornerbacks Kobe Bryant and Sauce Gardner, safety Brian Cook, edge rusher Myjai Sanders, Darian Beavers, a linebacker, are all gone. Only 2 defensive starters in totality are back next year. How on God's green earth do you fix that and, make sure that you can get to that last level that you were at? You don't. You've got to figure it out on the fly. And that results in their 16 spot drop between the years, which is far and away the largest drop that we've had to this point. So it's going to be difficult. I also don't really love their quarterback situation. I would imagine Ben Bryant is going to be the starter. He used to be the backup at Cincinnati. He transferred to Eastern Michigan last year to get some playing time. Wasn't super impressed with him, but I do imagine, since he already knows the system, he will likely be the starter. And no matter how highly I think of Luke Fickell, the turnaround and getting this fixed is going to be a nightmare for just about any coach, and not something that most coaches are able to do. So getting your team back into the top 20 is a feat that most would love to have right now if they had that roster, because that is just extremely impressive when you look at it in totality. So Cincinnati cracking the top 20, just barely getting in at that top 20 spot. But I do still think that they'll be a really competitive program, one that probably loses to Arkansas, loses another game, and wins out a lot of their AAC competition before they make the jump to Big 10 or Big 12 rather, and we can't even call them a group of 5 anymore. So that is the next batch of teams that we've got. What do you think about those? Anybody that hasn't appeared yet that you're shocked by? Any predictions for the last 5 or my notable inclusions? Feel free to let me know in the comments below. But for now, that is episode 19 of the From My Perspective podcast. Make sure to subscribe, and as always, I'll see you next time.